can I just make a comment about questions and so on in the programme? So the plan today is that Kevin's going to speak for about 45 minutes. We don't have the benefit of somebody in the audience shouting out 10 minutes to go, as we normally have. I first thought that was hecklers when I first heard somebody say that to Kevin, but we are assured that Kevin has timed his lecture to perfection as always, and that really won't be necessary. The chat function is running, so we do invite you to make any comments either to all of the audience or just to ourselves as panelists. There will be a Q&A session at the end, so Kevin won't be trying to answer questions as we go on. That would be a nightmare. So, but we will try to answer as many questions in a little bit of a Q&A at the end, which I'll be conducting with Kevin. So we'll see if we can mop up a few things there. But in the meantime, I think we need to move on to the lecture. I must say it's a stunning title you've chosen this time around, Kevin. Invention, Acumen and Espionage. Who wouldn't want to come to a lecture with a title like that? It does feel a little bit like the lot of a local historian, doesn't it? Some of those probably not too much of the espionage, but I know we all like to protect our sources when we've got something really interesting. And we're really looking forward to your talk, exploring the life and times of three of those captains of industry who were really key to the development of the Industrial Revolution in Leeds, but also had a much bigger impact, nationally and internationally, and who've left a tremendous legacy for us here in Leeds today, with three very notable buildings that are part of our industrial and architectural heritage. So I think it's time to pass over to you, Kevin, and we'll invite you to the stand, so to speak, and look forward to hearing what you have to say for us today.
Yeah, just to say, Richard, before you disappear, of course, people must appreciate that when I give this lecture, I won't actually see anybody. As far as I'm concerned, all I see on my screen is my slides and me. So after about 20 minutes, I'll begin to wonder whether I'm just talking to myself. But anyway, it's an exciting thing. So shall I start screen sharing then, Martin?
Yeah, let me just do that for you.
Are you going to enable me to do it?
Yeah, you should be able to do it
now let's see what happens. Nope, nothing yet. All right, now let's see. I've got that out now. All right, and all right, I'll just have to come out just for a moment to get to that, so I can let's see, get it there. All right, that should be working. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, fine. Yeah, okay. All right, I shall start. Well, yes, it's wonderful to, I can say see you all on this occasion, but of course I can't see you at all, but I assume you're there and will enjoy the lecture. So I'm very delighted to give what is my 14th annual series of Leeds in Your Lunch Hour lectures. It is remarkable, as Richard was saying, that this time last year, although we'd heard about a virus in China, effectively we were packed into Leeds Minster and feeling quite relaxed. 4 weeks later it was a very different story, but it's great that thanks to the miracles of Zoom that we can actually do the lectures again. Now, I've been quite a busy boy during pandemic. As many of you will know, the Blue Plux book that I did with Bob Tyrrell went to the printers in July and was launched in October. And at the same time, meanwhile, I've been working like a demon with Stephen Burt on the long promised history of Hunslet. Now, initially, I thought whether I could actually give these lectures. Maybe I shouldn't give the lectures because I needed to focus on Hunslet. But Stephen tells me that our progress has been sufficient, that he's allowing me time off for good behaviour. So the question was, how could I, in one sense, give the lectures but not totally give up on writing Hunslet for a while? And what in fact I've done is I've taken 4 lectures which I gave 4 years ago, which have not, 12 years ago I prepared, and which essentially I've extensively revised and added to. So it's rather fun sort of adding this new material. It's made it very interesting for me to do so. And I'd like to thank the Thoresby Society, and in particular, and also Leeds City Libraries and Museums for the availability of these images, which you'll see today. As Richard will no doubt say, of course, in the past with these lectures in physical form, there was always a bucket collection at the end, and in each of the series, in effect, something over £1,000 has been raised, which has been given jointly to Leeds Civic Trust and Leeds Minster. This year, I'm delighted to say that the Civic Trust is ensuring that all proceeds will go to Leeds Minster, and I think at the end, Mike, it'll be announced whether, how you can make donations. So if you enjoy the lectures, I hope you will. Right, so Invention, Acumen and Espionage, the Industrial Revolution in Leeds. I must start with a cautionary note about this, which is that, of course, I am an economic historian, and I always think that people like me take their lives in their hands when you get into the issue of technology and science. Those of you who are engineers or have a science background may shoot historians like me down in flames as we blunder from one howler to another on the issue of technology. So I have to be brave and I have to press on. Well, between 1790 and 1840, Leeds was transformed. It experienced the Industrial Revolution. Oh, there we go. Yeah. The Industrial Revolution had begun in Lancashire in the 1760s with the building of the cotton mills. Now, the woolen textile industry of the West Riding of Yorkshire was initially very slow to follow. But between 1790 and 1840, the character and landscape of Leeds was transformed by the arrival of the factory age. Leeds was one of the first towns in the world to experience an industrial revolution. It was an age both exciting and traumatic. Vast fortunes were made, and yet many livelihoods were destroyed by the changes. While in one sense, the streets of Leeds seemed almost paved with gold, the rustic charm of the market town was destroyed by the factories, whose chimneys belched out lots of noxious vapours, and Leeds was never the same again. Now, what we're seeing here is Charles Cope's engraving produced in 1826, titled A View of Leeds. As you can see, it looks up the river towards Crown Point and the town, and it wonderfully captures the smoky atmosphere of the town at this point. And you wonder whether is this pride saying, look at all our industry, or is it in condemnation with all the smoke? But here we see we're looking west into the town, Bank Mills there, Leeds Lock on the navigation where the Royal Armoury sits today. There is Crown Point Weir. And then on the hillside going up, we see the tower of the parish church, and then a bit further up, the tower of St. John's, and then in the distance, the tower of Holy Trinity Church. The results of this transformation are wonderfully described by Prince Hermann von Puckler in his account of his tour through England in 1828. Funnily enough, his description in his book mirrors really quite well the image that we see in front of us. And it's possible that von Puckler came into Leeds in 1828 by boat. And this is what he says. I reached the great manufacturing town of Leeds just in the twilight. A transparent cloud of smoke was diffused over the whole space which it occupies on and between several hills. 100 red fires shot upwards into the sky, and as many towering chimneys poured forth columns of smoke. The huge manufactories, 5 stories high, in which every window was illuminated, had a grand striking effect. Here the toiling artisan labours far into the night, and that some romantic features may not be wanting in the whirl of business and the illumination of industry, 2 ancient Gothic churches reared their heads above the mass of the houses, and the moon poured her silver light upon their towers, and seemed to damp the hard glare of busy crowd below with serene majesty. It's a wonderful quote. Anyway, between 1790 and 1841, the town's population grew dramatically, at least trebling from around 25,000 to over 88,000. The population of the parish and the borough increased from some 40,000 to over 150,000. This was astonishing growth. I mean, the number of houses in the town alone grew from 6,000 to 20,000 in the period. The built fabric of the town extended astonishingly, but very haphazardly. As one contemporary commented, it was as if the town had an earthquake for an architect. Now we come to the issue of mills. In 1789, there were no mills in Leeds in the sense that we understand today. Yes, there were water mills that ground things. There were workshops where craftsmen worked, perhaps maybe making all manner of products, but perhaps only, at most having 30 to 40 workers, but that was it. Curiously, it was the cotton industry that provided the first glimpse of the factory age in Leeds. 2 steam-powered cotton mills were erected in 1790 by the pioneer of speculative working-class housing. He was also a soap boiler, and this was Richard Paley. Now, as you can see from this view, all these numbers are part of Richard Paley's really rather extensive estate of land that he built up. But at 20, up from the weir at Crown Point, up on the bank, there were 2 cotton mills which he erected in 1790. One known as Bank Low Cotton Mill and the other known as Bank Top Cotton Mill. Now, there were other people that followed him, and by 1800 there were around 10 cotton mills in Leeds, which employed between them about 2,000 people. But this proved to be a very short-term experiment. By 1810, almost all of the cotton mills had closed down. Perhaps, they just couldn't compete with Lancashire. Cotton was Manchester, Leeds was a woolen cloth making town. Until the 1790s, the West Riding woolen cloth industry was essentially a handicraft industry conducted in cottages and small workshops. It was primarily only the fulling of cloth which used water power. The first great entrepreneur of this mold-breaking period, a hero to some and a villain to others, was Benjamin Gott. Now, he had served his apprenticeship as a gentleman merchant with Wormold, Fountain and Gott, which was one of the 5 largest woolen cloth merchant firms in Leeds. By fortuitous circumstances, in 1790, at the age of 27, he gained control of the firm. Being full of energy and drive, he was very frustrated by the fact that he had frequent inability to buy all the traditional Yorkshire broad and narrow cloths that he wanted, to buy them from the cloth halls. Equally, he was eager to obtain a supply of the highly lucrative superfine cloth, which was usually made in the West Country, which was very much in demand at the time, particularly in the United States. To meet these requirements, and in contravention of all that was held sacred by his fellow gentlemen merchants, he launched out boldly upon the manufacture of woolen cloth. He built a massive mill complex of 16 acres at Beaning on the western edge of the town. Now, here you can see it. This is the 1815 Giles Plan. There is Park Row, the Cloth Hall, Park Square up here, and right across the fields, by the river is Park Mills, or at Beaning, or maybe Droney Lathe, but that is the location. In fact, it's the site where the Yorkshire Post building was until it was demolished a few years ago. Within 10 years, and here we see his wonderful Park Mills, Wellington Street is on this side. Going across here, you see at the back of the building is the River Aire going that way. And, you know, interesting features. And in particular, there is, because you'll see it again, there is the gasometer, the famous gasometer at Benjamin Gott's works. Well, within 10 years, he'd extended his operation to Arnby Mills and to Burley Mills higher up in the Aire Valley. By 1797, he employed 1,200 workers, and from 1800 to 1820, he was reckoned to be one of the top 10 largest employers in the whole country. And at that point, he had also become quite literally a millionaire in the days when you could buy a back-to-back house for £50. So he was fabulously rich. Despite becoming a manufacturer, the merchanting of cloth actually remained Gott's principal business. He continued to patronize the domestic clothers extensively by buying 3/4 of his cloth, actually, at the Leeds and Huddersfield cloth halls. He also bought some cloth privately, directly from the clothiers. Now, Park Mills, as his mill was known, enabled him to finish these immense quantities of cloth to a very high standard for resale, and to manufacture his own supply of superfines. By 1813, he had 133 looms and 253 workers engaged in spinning and weaving at the mill. But the key thing about Gott is that the revolution that he brought about was primarily organizational rather than technological. His workers still use, as we see here, the traditional techniques of spinning and weaving. But the difference was that these former domestic workers and their equipment were brought into a factory situation for the first time where they could work under close supervision. In fact, he didn't introduce water or steam power for spinning or weaving for many years. Power was only used for the preparation of wool and the finishing processes. Very significantly from our point of view, in 1792, he bought a steam engine from Bolton and Watt of Soho, Birmingham. He used this to drive scribbling and carding machines and to lift fulling stocks and for grinding dye woods. Park Mills was a woolen mill of quite exceptional size, and it stood alone in the town for almost a decade or more. Perhaps there were only 20 factories of all types in Leeds in 1801. However, Gott's high profits inevitably tempted other people into the field, and by 1822 there were no less than 30 woolen merchant manufacturers in Leeds, plus 30 firms that were regarded as woolen manufacturing. That is, they didn't actually sell the cloth. These 40 or so factories formed the lion's share of the 50 to 70 factories in the borough by this time. Well, Gott's achievements were remarkable, but perhaps even more astonishing was the rise of this man you see here, John Marshall, for he almost single-handedly turned Leeds into the country's principal flax spinning and linen producing centre. In 1781, aged 16, Marshall entered his father's linen draper's business in Mill Hill, and when his father died in 1787, he became head of the business. And like Gott, he made the most of the opportunity. These were men in their 20s, relatively young. In 1788, in partnership with Samuel Fenton and Ralph Dearlove, he leased Scotland Mill, a water mill, alongside the Adel Beck in Adel. There, with the assistance of Matthew Murray, a young engineer recently arrived from Stockton-on-Tees, he overcame some of the technical difficulties in adapting cotton spinning machinery to spin flax into linen yarn. He soon moved production to Holbeck on a site on the north side of Water Lane between the Holbeck and the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. And as we can see here in the box, the red box at the top, between 1791 and 1792, he erected a 4-storey water-powered mill with a large warehouse, a counting house, stables, a dry house, shops of smiths and joiners, and several cottages. But what is significant is that he very quickly abandoned using water power, and he substituted a 20 horsepower Boulton and Watts steam engine. From 1793 to 1800, with new business partners, Thomas and Benjamin Benyon, the business grew prodigiously. Besides spinning and bleaching linen yarns for sale, the firm also produced coarse, heavy linen cloth such as canvas and hessian. By 1803, Marshall employed over 1,000 workers. So again, like Gott, this is a huge undertaking compared with anything that had gone before. No other flax spinner in the whole country came anywhere near to him in size. John Marshall was a brilliant entrepreneur. He was also undoubtedly a domineering man who used other people like puppets, casting them aside as they ceased to be useful to him. The Leeds Intelligencer in 1828 accused him of using fair or unfair means to accomplish his ends. But by 1830, like Gott, he was quite literally a millionaire. In contrast to Gott, though, he used powered machinery from the start. Moreover, he actually pioneered the foundation of a major new industry in Leeds. Edward Baines, in his directory of Leeds in 1822, observed that there were several manufactories inferior in extent to very few in the kingdom that had been established in Leeds for spinning flax, for making canvas, linen, sacking, etc. And indeed, by 1821, there were 19 flax spinning firms in Leeds, and by 1855, the number of firms had risen to 37, so it had become a really big industry. Messrs. Hives and Atkinson were former partners of Marshall, who he disposed of, in a sense, in the mid-1820s, and their reaction was to build their own enormous flax spinning mills just down the river, as we see them here, directly opposite the Royal Armouries. So here we see Bank Mills. Well, now we move on to the Leeds engineering industry. Gott and Marshall and their emulators could only make their dramatic achievements with the aid of ingenious engineers and machine makers. One of the most brilliant inventive engineers who pioneered the use of steam engines and flax hackling machinery was, of course, Matthew Murray, the father of the Leeds engineering industry. And of course, as so many people remark, it's a terrible injustice that in City Square we have a statue of James Watt, for certainly that statue should be a statue of Matthew Murray. The rapid growth of the textile industry in Leeds and its region generated considerable demand for machinery and utensils. Hackles and gills, combs, gears, sleighs, steam engines, and later machine tools, locomotives, cranes, boilers, and a host of other products were eagerly sought. Murray, as we've seen, and here is the man, Murray, as we've seen, arrived in Leeds from Stockton-on-Tees in 1788 and worked with Marshall at Scotland Mill, where he soon became the chief mechanic. In 1790, he moved with Marshall to Holbeck. In that year, he took out his first patent, and this was, quote, a machine for flax spinning, cotton and silk. 3 years later, he took out a patent for, quote, instruments and machines for spinning fibrous materials, which included a carding engine and a spinning machine. He introduced sponge weights and a process of wet spinning of flax, which created a revolution in the trade. Well, in 1795, after he'd been with Marshall for about 7 years, he was invited to join James Fenton and David Wood in establishing a works for making and repairing machinery and engines. Fenton found most of the capital, Murray took charge of the engine building department, and Wood dealt with the construction and design of machinery. First of all, they took a workshop in Mill Green, Holbeck, but they needed more space, and so they found the site near Campfield in Water Lane, opposite Marshall's Mill. And of course, here is the site today, which we know as the Round Foundry site. So you've come down Water Lane from Victoria Bridge. On the right-hand side, you can't see it, but the Holbeck is there. And this is the Round Foundry complex. Now, in this splendid but slightly fuzzy engraving, shows the Round Foundry as it looked in about 1802. They erected an impressive circular workshop, which we see on the left here, from which the works became known as the Round Foundry. Murray now devoted his entire energies to make improvements to his steam engines, which afterwards became the subject of several patents. In 1811, John Blenkinsop, the manager of Middleton Colliery, patented a system of hauling coal wagons on the colliery railway. Now, beyond saying that a steam engine is greatly to preferred, the patent does not describe an engine that was going to pull the railway, but only and you can see them here, only at the bottom here, the cog wheel and the rack rail, which of course looks as if it's sort of got teeth in it to provide, you know, the connection rail to engine, etc. It was Matthew Murray in 1812 who designed and constructed the locomotive engine, which we see here. This is a model which ran on the track. As you see, it has pinions that work a cogwheel which engages with the rack rail on one side of the track. Murray made 4 locomotives in all, which were supplied to Middleton Colliery, and they ran very successfully until 1835. Thus, the world's first commercially successful steam locomotive was invented and built in Leeds. So forget about George Stephenson, it was Murray that was first. And again, in this 1829 wonderful engraving, we see the Middleton Railway with the Salamanca, Murray's engine, drawing the wagons with coal in it, drawing them to the coal stave near Leeds Bridge. And in the background, we're in Holbeck, so in the background there is Christchurch Meadow Lane, built in the 1820s. It's important to note, by the way, that as a working class mechanic in origin, Matthew Murray was greatly inferior in social status to Gott and Marshall, which was certainly reflected in Gott's attitude to him, as we shall see. Well, what about the wider aspects of the Industrial Revolution in Leeds? Gott, Marshall and Murray were the stars of the Industrial Revolution in Leeds, but they were pioneers of their industries and they were enormously successful. But there were many others who emulated them and played their part in the rapid growth of industry and employment in the town. In addition to its great entrepreneurs, there were many advantages which help explain the rapid growth of Leeds as an industrial centre. First of all, here we see Middleton Colliery and the famous railway. Of course, Leeds had plentiful supplies of coal on its doorstep. At the same time, it had large quantities of building stone, which could be brought up the canal to the town centre and beyond. And here we see Bramley Fall Quarry on the side of the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, and just beyond it you can see the tower of Kirkstall Abbey. There were also large quantities of timber coming into the town, and here we see Crown Point Wharf and Sawmill, which was on the north bank of the river just to the east of Crown Point Bridge. And then, of course, the Aire and Calder navigation itself and the Leeds and Liverpool Canal made Leeds an inland port. So large quantities of raw materials could be brought in by water, and of course the products that were produced could be taken out by water. So this was a huge advantage. And also, of course, there was the development of turnpike roads, which were very useful. And there, of course, there were so many industries that developed in Leeds, and in this 1830 approximately view of Leeds, this picture by Alphonse Dussault, we're looking down more or less from Middleton stroke of Beeston over Holbeck, Hunslet and Holbeck, and we see the potteries, the glassworks, chimneys of all sorts, and this depicts the situation that had been achieved by the 1830s. But of course, what a key element of this lecture is, of course, the espionage. What of the espionage referred to in the title of today's lecture? Now, what I want to do is to give you some of the flavour of the times in industrial Holbeck in the first decade of the 19th century. And it's great that the buildings concerned referred to here, some of them are still there on Water Lane. What was going on at the time and the rivalries is wonderfully conveyed by the dealings between Leeds entrepreneurs and the steam engine makers, Matthew Boulton and James Watt. The engineer James Watt and the Birmingham entrepreneur Matthew Boulton had gone into partnership in 1775, and they were based at Boulton's Soho manufactory, which in the 1760s was on the edge of Birmingham, and which produced steel jewellery, buckles, buttons, silver plate articles and other products. And here we see Matthew Murray's Soho manufactory. I say not Soho Foundry, but Soho manufactory. Boulton encouraged Watt to develop his work on the improvement of steam engines. They made very large profits from making steam engines, but they also made a lot of money from charging other makers and users premiums for the use of Watt's patents. Boulton and Watt's first connection with Leeds came in 1792 when they installed one of their engines at John Marshall's flax mills in Water Lane. Indeed, Marshall bought several Boulton and Watt engines as his business expanded. In 1793, they also installed one of their engines at Benjamin Gott's Park Mills. And here we see the mills, just to orientate you. This is 1831. We're looking north. There is the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. This is Wellington Bridge. There is the river flowing over another part of Wellington Bridge. And there is Gott's, Beaning, Park Mills. And just as I point out there, there is the gasometer, which is so distinctive. Well, an intimate friendship then developed between Gott and the engine builders, which lasted for many years. Indeed, James Lawson of Soho, who had come to Leeds to supervise the installation of the engine at Gott's factory, was a welcome guest at Gott's home, where in later years Gott had a bust of James Watt. By the 1790s, it was actually the sons of the original Boulton and Watt who were running the business at Soho, and they used Park Mills as a base to which their travelling representatives resorted to collect letters and instructions when they were in the north. from there, they also launched attacks on those who were pirating Watt's patents, especially two ironworks in Bradford, the Low Moor Ironworks and the Bowling Ironworks. The Bowling Ironworks actually, well, what's so interesting about Bowling is that Richard Paley, who we've already met, was a partner in the Bowling Ironworks, and it was there that they started to make a small number of steam engines. In January 1796, James Watt Jr., then aged 27, came up to Leeds on a pirate hunting expedition. Before coming, Benjamin Gott supplied him the names of the Bowling owners and also of the owner of a Leeds cotton mill using a Bowling engine. Also, he secured the services of a lawyer for Bolton and Watt. Well, James Watt Jr.'s visit proved profitable, for various orders were made for his steam engines. Writing to his father, though, he said, "Marshall and Benyon are in want of another, and we have had a most curious conversation, and too long to detail at present." This was with John Marshall. Suffice it to say that Marshall is an arrant Jesuit, and that I came up to Mr. Whately's character of me in negotiations is sure. In other words, he'd had a very, very difficult negotiation with John Marshall over his purchase of a steam engine. Meanwhile, Watt Jr. set out to try and get a glimpse of the steam engines in Leeds, which he believed were in breach of his father's patents. He got into the cotton mill, which was under suspicion in Leeds, and in fact this was one of Richard Paley's cotton mills at the bank. And he identified that the air pump of the condenser of its machinery was probably a copy of his father's design. And in his letter he said, "But the concealed situation of the condenser and its machinery prevented us from seeing it. The engine man was violently suspicious, but yet, like a blockhead, let us inspect as much as we wanted and gave us full information about the air pump." At the next mill they went to, which was Paley's other mill, number 20 up on this plan, he introduced himself as a Manchester man interested in cotton mill engines. But he did not act the part sufficiently well. I mean, one guesses that perhaps his Brummie accent gave him away. His host became suspicious and he was bundled out of the mill. And he wrote to his father, "Soon the news was all around the town that two of the patent fellows were prowling round." Well, an injunction was immediately secured against Sturgis of the Bowling Ironworks and all users of Bowling engines. They were forbidden to make any more engines in which Watt's patents were used. 6 months later, Richard Paley, who we see here, capitulated. He scrapped the engine that he was using and bought one from Soho. Well, then we move on to the battle between Matthew Murray and James Watt. Watt's patents and the premiums he got from the use of them were due to expire in 1800. So the firm decided that to maintain and expand its profits, it must greatly increase its own production of steam engines and outdo any potential rival engine makers with the quality of their products. And so in 1796, they opened the Soho Foundry. I have a picture there on the right because I rather like this, because my father was an engineer who moved from Sunderland during the wartime when he was a very young man, and he had to report at this gateway working for Avery's as the Soho Foundry, as it had become. Well, the battle between Murray and Murray and Bolton and Watt intensified. The skullduggery and industrial espionage that they engaged in to try and thwart Murray and pinch his ideas is wonderfully described in letters, and it brings the round foundry and its buildings absolutely to life. Now, Bolton's son was Matthew Robinson Jr., And basically, he wrote letters back to James Watt Jr. to tell him how he was getting on. Here we see Matthew. When I first gave this lecture, I could only find a picture of Matthew Bolton when he was 3, so we had to make use of that. But fortunately, I found another one of him on the right at a later age. In January 1799, Bolton and Watt sent their engineer and future partner, William Murdoch, up to Leeds to spy on Murray, and it didn't prove difficult. Murray was surprisingly easy to dupe. Matthew Robinson Bolton wrote to James Watt Jr., quote, "Murdoch and Abraham," that is the foundry manager at Soho, "are now returned from their excursion, highly delighted and full of panegyrics upon Murray's excellent work. Abraham is now entirely convinced that of his inferiority," that's Abraham's inferiority, "and what is more, of the possible amendment, and he is now actually making trials of different substances to mix with the sand used by Murray. We have written to McMurdo to send a load of sand of the type used by Murray. It seems his forge work is still better. His work is still better than his castings, and we're trying, therefore, to infuse a spirit of amendment into this department of the works." They were admitted to every part of Murray's manufactory and spent 2 evenings with him, and by virtue of a plentiful dose of ale, succeeded in extracting from him the arcana and mysteries of his superior performance. I should inform you that Murray presented Murdoch with a specimen of his forge work, no doubt with a view of exciting his astonishment and perhaps a despair of ever attempting the same perfection, for I must candidly acknowledge it was the most beautiful and perfect piece of work I ever beheld. The emulation of our men has been awakened, and they now vie with each other in adopting the tools and improvements suggested by Murdoch. Suggested by Murdoch. Our first imitative essays have succeeded and completely, and we entertain great hopes of turning out the working gear in such a manner as will render filing a superfluous operation. Murray was absolutely outraged he'd been duped, particularly when he was accused by Bolton and Watt of having stolen their ideas. And in July 1803, in a notice in the Leeds Mercury, he recalled the visit. He wrote, "Mr. Murdoch, upon taking his leave of us, expressed a wish that as they and we were certainly the best engine makers in the country, we should always be upon good terms, and that ever I should go to Soho, they would be very glad indeed to show me all their works. I did go to Soho and was refused admittance into their manufactory of steam engines." Well, in June 1802, James Watt Jr. and Murdoch returned to Leeds and spied on Murray and attempted to subvert his employees. Halligan, a former employee at Soho, was now working for Murray, and Watt hoped to lure him to bring him back to Soho, bringing Murray's secrets with him. Moreover, they attempted to buy land around Murray's round foundry to try and stop him expanding. James Watt wrote, "I've been surveying the environments of this rival establishment and making inquiries respecting the property and the tenure of the neighbouring lands, with a view to seeing whether we can purchase anything under their very nose that might materially annoy them and eventually benefit ourselves. I find there are 2 acres of land next to Murray's works which may be purchased, but the price will be £500 to £600 per acre. But there is a malt house which projects into their premises, which they have in vain endeavoured to purchase at a moderate rate. This would enable us, if we purchased it, to overlook the whole yard, and holding it holding it, we might be able to dictate terms. And then he goes on to describe Matthew Murray's wonderful rotunda in some detail. Splendid. He thinks it's probably the best foundry of its type in the country. Later on, they then want to know what's happening in the green sand foundry, which of course is still there today on Water Lane. Halligan, their former employee, is employed solely in the dry sand foundry, which he says they do worse than we. However, he is sensible of the great perfection of their green sand work, which he attributes entirely to the sand. He says that it is exactly the same as we have at our foundry, but we spoil it by mixing too much coal dust with it. The bottom of this green sand foundry, which is a distinct building, consists of 4 feet of this sand, which they work over and over again and never renewed since he has been there for 13 weeks. Well, the conclusion to all this was that Halligan was brought back into the Boulton & Watt's employ, but he stayed at Murray's Works and was left there as a spy. They also looked at the dry sand foundry, where they got further details, and they say, we shall have drawings and complete information respecting this machinery. So they were trying to pay people to produce drawings of machines and bring them back to Soho. Well, where did this all end? Well, the answer is this. Murray was so upset by the unpleasant things, the lies he believed that Boulton & Watt told about him, that he put a notice in the Leeds Intelligencer newspaper as a challenge to them in 1803. And this said, the world, I believe, cares very little about Messrs. Boulton & Watt stealing my inventions or my stealing theirs. What people want of us are good engines, but I am confident I can make good ones. And as they hint that no one can do that but themselves, I am willing to end this dispute for the good of the public. And what he did was he proposed that there should be a competition between them to prove who made the best engines. But of course, the cowards Boulton & Watt would not take part. Well, so Murray did, in the end, prove to be very, very successful. Essentially, a survey was made of steam engines in Leeds in 1824. There were 129 steam engines in use in Leeds at that time, 129. Of them, 77 had been made by Murray and only 6 by Boulton & Watt. So should we get the statue of Matthew Murray in City Square as it should be? Well, I'm now at my conclusion, and it's about Temple Mill, just a couple of minutes, and then that will be it. Without doubt, the finest monument to this phase of the Industrial Revolution in Leeds is Temple Mill in Marshall Street. In the late 1830s, John Marshall, or really his son James Garth Marshall, decided that a very large additional mill was needed for their ever-expanding production. The result was one of the world's most astonishing industrial buildings. Despite its antique exterior, it was the most technologically advanced and innovative factory in the world. So impressed was the Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, that he chose to describe it in his novel, Sybil. The mill is vast, has a single story, it's a single story building, 125 meters by 70 meters, covering 2 acres on a cast iron frame with a flat roof carried on brick vaulting. Conical skylights, as you see in this beautiful illustration, in the roof provide everyday even light into the whole factory, and ventilators in the top of each help to control the internal environment. Its weaving shed was the largest room in the world. Now, large quantities of grass grew on the roof. The brick vaulting of the roof was covered on the outside by roof plaster, And then on top of the roof plaster, there was a mixture of coal tar and lime to form a waterproof layer. To insulate this delicate waterproof membrane, and to stop it, I suppose, melting in bright sunlight, it was covered with 8 inches of earth, which was sown with grass to hold it in place. And here we see the roof. It's entirely true that sheep did graze on the top of the building to keep the grass short. There was a time when I thought that this was a myth, and people always say, is it true? Well, actually, I found several sources that confirm it. The best one comes from Henry Schroeder's book written in 1851, which describes the flax spinning industry in Leeds, and commenting on this building, he says, "The mill belonging to Messrs. Marshall and Co. is the largest of its kind in Europe, and indeed in the world. It consists of but one story, covering an area of more than 3 acres. Massy arches support the roof, over the whole of which glass domes are placed equidistant, affording ample light to the operatives." And this is the killer sentence: "The external surface is covered with grass, on which sheep may frequently be seen grazing." So it is true. So today, the problem, of course, is that this wonderful monument to the Industrial Revolution in Leeds is under threat of collapse. And of course, it needs to be saved. And it may be that the British Library taking this building, perhaps in 5 or 6 time, may be the answer. So thank you very much for watching and listening.
Well, Kevin, that's been amazing. Thank you so much on behalf of all the participants who've witnessed that, which is over 300 of them. We'd all like to say a hearty thank you very much for that fascinating and insightful survey of those such interesting times when Leeds really was, I don't know, it's almost like the Wild West of industry, isn't it, really, with all of the all the shenanigans that were going on. We do have a number of questions that I think really arise out of that, which would be really interesting to explore. But given that we've just talked about Temple Mills, what is the latest information that you have in terms of the future of that site? Because it seems to me that so many of these buildings that were really innovative and are really important, both architecturally and in terms of the way that they organise production, are actually some of the most challenging to find new uses for. And you get places like the Temple works, which you know, it seems for decades we've been looking to find a developer and an architectural team and really put that to good use for the future.
Well, I mean, of course, obviously, you know, there was the collapse of one of the domes which fell through the roof, well, 1.5, and then I mean, we're talking more than 10 years ago now. Now, the building was owned by the Barclay brothers. And there have been several schemes in, but certainly say in the last 10 years, there was the idea that it should be taken over by Situ, you know, the innovative housing developer who thought that they could renovate the building, and in partnership with using council land, it would have been, well, unsure quite what the use of the Temple building was, but it would have been surrounded by housing. And of course, you know, Tom Reard and Judith Blake and the council were looking for some inspired use for the building. Then, of course, just on the brink of Situ embarking on their scheme for it, Burberry, of course, came in and said, actually, we think we'd like to move our production to Leeds, and they were going to use the mill as a, you know, sort of giant showroom as much as anything, but build factories around it. And then, of course, they backed out, you know, I think what sort of 2017, the Barclay brothers then got totally frustrated and said, right, we've had enough of this, and put the building up for auction. And on the eve of the auction, they sold it for £1 to CEG, the Commercial Estates Group, that were already doing developments in the location and bought land. And basically, CEG have been trying to stabilise the building. You know, they have a scheme for it, but the question is what would go in it. And then, of course, the idea that the British Library, you know, we've got Boston Spa in Leeds, but the British Library would be, you know, almost a showroom base in Leeds, British Library of the North. And in the budget last year, Rishi Sunak kindly, as part of the devolution deal, gave, in effect, the city £25 million towards the British Library project. So I think, you know, we won't see it in the immediate future, but the time scale is, you know, sort of an exhibition facility, a place where you can go and read books, but also, you know, a sort of centre for all sorts of activities and exhibitions. So, I mean, that is a fantastic prospect. And we just keep our fingers crossed that it goes ahead.
Well, thank you for that update, Kevin. May sheep safely graze up there.
I wasn't going to come back on. Sorry,
point.
Richard, I wasn't going to come back on, but just to say, I put something on the chat there about Temple Works. We are hoping to have an event next month looking at Temple Works and looking at the future use with the British Library. So if people are interested in that, then, you know, we will be sending out an invitation to attend that probably in the next week or two. So that's definitely going to happen.
That's really good.
I'm going to disappear again because I wasn't supposed to come back on.
Thank you very much for that, Martin. And I think it's going to be a question of watch this space, but you know, that certainly sounds like a fantastic session to get Civic Trust members again involved in you know, looking at the plans and looking at the ideas in terms of how all of that might move forward. Kevin, if we might just move on to another area that's cropped up in the chat as well. I think it's a very topical one as well. We've got so many historical figures these days that who've had statues erected in their honour and who are kind of lauded as great figures within our history. And there's been a lot of revisionism going on recently, as we're well aware, some in more graphic terms than others. But certainly, in terms of these figures that we've got here, what's your assessment really, with the benefit of a bit of hindsight, as to their legacy, and how do they stand up against other figures that we might look at from that era?
Well, I mean, yes, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, as it happens, clearly Murray and Marshall, fortunately for us, their buildings, or parts of their buildings, the round foundry, of course, was demolished. Well, sorry, it caught fire and had to be demolished. And so from that point of view, we still have the buildings. And, you know, as I was saying earlier, it's great that you can go down for a drink at the midnight bell and you're actually surrounded by those buildings in which, you know, these were buildings that Bolton and Watt actually got into, and it brings the whole thing to life. Obviously with Marshall's buildings, well, what are there? There are sort of, well, there are two effectively, or maybe three, depending on how that survived. So, you know, their legacy in that sense is secure. I think you were saying to me, Richard, that, you know, in terms of the Gott family, you know, again, their legacy is partly in churches like St. Bartholomew's, I think, at Armley, which was endowed by the Gotts. But wasn't there a Gott who was associated with the parish church?
Yes, indeed. John Gott, the grandson of Benjamin, he was the vicar of Leeds in the 1870s. Yeah. And again, really important figure in the development of the church. But probably one of the things that he's most remembered for is he's the person who reclaimed the stones of the Leeds cross, which, as we know, had been taken by the architect Chantrel when he rebuilt the church in the 1830s. And he'd erected them in his garden. And when he moved to the south of England, he'd taken them with him. So Gott was the vicar who went and banged on the door of the house, which would then pass to a new owner, demanding that the cross be returned to Leeds. And after a bit of negotiation, he succeeded in doing that. And I've just recently discovered, actually, that Gott's grave is buried in Cornwall. This is John Gott, of course. His grave marker is a perfect replica of the Leeds cross. So if you're on holiday in Cornwall, you can see a little bit of Leeds, or a little bit of Anglo-Scandinavian Leeds at least,
Yeah.
in a churchyard in Cornwall. So again, another bit of legacy, and that, I suppose, Gott dynasty, very, very influential and active in so many other fields, as well as
Yes.
manufacturing and industry.
Yes, I mean, it's disappointing that Benjamin Gott's mill, the world's first woolen mill, was demolished, because it was still there. I mean, it wasn't there when I came to Leeds as a student in 1969, but I think it was demolished, I don't know, about sort of the early 1960s. And of course, in a sense, in a different age, that would have been a World Heritage Site. So we lost that. But yes, Matthew Murray, I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, I think I was looking at things like Samuel Smiles, Lives of the Engineers, and self-help, and all those wonderful Victorian stories where James Watt is all over the place, and I think there's more or less a biography of James Watt, and you're thinking, Murray should be there. Well, of course, Murray is recognised now in Leeds, through the naming of schools and all sorts of things, but well, you get into the issue, if you seriously thought, should we move James Watt out of City Square and get somebody to knock up something in the style and say, here you are, Matthew Murray's there. But I mean, it's interesting, for a lot of these other people, busts, there are busts of John Marshall and Gotts and other worthies, but not one of Murray, you see, because Murray was a roughneck. I mean, he didn't belong to the elite in the same way, which I think is really why Benjamin Gott didn't like him. But you do feel sorry that he was naive enough to think, oh, isn't it nice, the great Bolton and Watt have come to see my factory. And in fact, they were just, I mean, the skullduggery and the terminology, blockheads letting them in and this sort of stuff. But the issue of statues in general is, we did, the trust has looked at the issue of, I think, statues and blue plaques, and in one sense, concluded, well, it was, independently led as it happened, but concluded that actually that in many ways, there are no great problems with the ones we've got, particularly in relation to, the slave trade and things like that. But the issue of whether you should have statues, because it's not that long ago, well, I mean, relatively speaking, that the trust, of course, with Martin Wainwright's help, financed the Arthur Aaron, well, in effect, statue, you might call it a monument at Eastgate. And of course, that was voted for by the public. They were very keen. And, and then you have this issue, should you produce figurative monuments to celebrate people, or should they be more abstract or whatever? But it's a bit of a minefield, this one, I think.
Certainly, and I think one of the pluses that we have, at least, is that we've got memorials to those characters in Leeds through their buildings, through their industrial endeavours, rather than an abundance of statues and memorials. Although we do have one of Benjamin Gott in Leeds Minster,
yes,
which is
indeed,
very nice to have. So some reminders of those times, and something that really does, I think, help to provide a connection with our past here. I do wonder if perhaps some of those other people, such as Bolton and Watt, actually just did a better job on the PR than some of our more local entrepreneurs and industrialists. And it's interesting to speculate whether the class issue did actually play against Murray in the way that his legacy is received. Certainly, George Stephenson actually came from a similar kind of background with his Northumbrian accent.
Yeah.
So there are others from that ilk who, particularly on the engineering side.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is when you look at it, that actually people like Marshall and Murray and indeed Richard Paley, they weren't poor to start off with. I mean, even Paley, I looked at that picture of Paley, which wonderful to see it, because we've only found about 7 years ago. The city bought it, and you look at him and you think, is he a roughneck, or is he, is he genteel? And then you think, oh well, actually, he could borrow, you know, £1,000 from his father, you know, and he married he married, I think at Armley Church, to a lady with a fortune of £1,000. You know, we're talking about the, you know, 1780s. So, you know, one way or another, if you were to succeed as a, you know, working class, in a sense, engineer, basically you needed to get the backing of somebody with money who could see the potential. But yes, it may well be, to some degree, that, you know, well, I think the issue is that people like Marshall and Gott were good self-publicists. You know, I mean, Marshall wrote his own autobiography to say what a clever chap he was. And you know, you get yourself up into society, and particularly if you get Samuel Smiles writing about you, then every school kid from about, you know, the 1880s to the 1950s ended up with a school prize, which told you about what self-help and you know, the heroes of that sort of period. So yes, being a self-publicist is rather good.
We did have one question on the chat as to whether Murray did himself become a millionaire. Did he have that consolation at least, Kevin?
Well, it's interesting. Well, the answer to that is I don't know the answer. I mean, the firm continued after he died. That's one thing. I mean, interestingly, Gott, of course, built, or he converted, Armley House with a grand park on up at Armley, whereas Murray built his house on the Holbeck Triangle, just north of Water Lane, which was famous because he heated it with steam. He had a steam central heating system. But of course, that, you know, okay, it was you know, a pleasant looking house, but he never got, maybe because he died, you know, relatively young, but basically he never seems to have done anything other than focus on producing steam engines. You know, the rest, you know, they invested money in all sorts of things. I mean, part of the fact they were millionaires was because they invested in government stocks and all sorts of different investments, as well as simply, you know, putting the money into their factories.
Well, it certainly sounds like Murray was a really kind of committed and exacting engineer, really, and the work across the board looks absolutely amazing. I think at that point, Kevin, it's probably time to wrap things up. Again, it's been fabulous. Oh, just a note here that Beaning Mill, I understand from Keith Williams, was demolished in 1963, so very well before your time in Leeds.
Yes.
So just to wrap up, thank you again so much, both to Kevin for his magnificent research and fabulous communication and lecture for us. I hope it's lifted everybody's spirits in what have been quite difficult times, I know, for all of us over the past year almost, really. So really good to bring people together again, and for the lunchtime lecture series to continue regardless of what's happening in the outside world. So thank you so much for that. We have got, this is only the first of a series of Wednesdays in February. So what have we got coming up next week, Kevin?
Well, next week is Grand Emporium, which is market halls, the Victorian market halls and exchanges. Now, this is a lecture that I gave 12 years ago, but I've changed this very considerably because I thought people have heard me talk about markets in Leeds on a number of occasions, and I thought, well, it'd be interesting to adapt the lecture. So the lecture will talk about what happened to them afterwards. That is one thing, and the other thing is that, you know, that we have the commercial buildings, which was an exchange buildings, which was seen in one of my earlier lectures. But the fact is that was replaced by the Royal Exchange in the 1870s. I've never talked about that before, and in my filing cabinets there's lots of interesting material. So I'm going to talk about what is, to me, in a sense, a new build, and also the Leeds Stock Exchange. I mean, some people have seen pictures of it, but, you know, what's its background? So in fact there will be some new treats, I think, in the lecture, which I've enjoyed working on. It's great that I have a big library at home and 8 filing cabinets stashed full of stuff that is allowing me to do this.
Right, we look forward to be spoiled again next week then. So thank you so much, and thank you everybody for your kind comments in the chat. It looks like it's been very much appreciated. And thanks to all those people, 200 plus, who've stayed with us right through to the end. Thank you so much. Take care of yourselves, and we'll look forward to seeing you again, same time, same place next week. Thank you.
Thank you.